I'm Jane Ryan, and I'm going to be introducing to you Mary Pat Linck, who has been involved with the Women's Center since the early days of the 70s, and she will give us a bit of her personal background, what brought her to Marquette, and what drew her to the Women's Center, and then the role that she played in that over some years. Mary Pat, welcome.
Thank you. Back in 1972, when I moved here, I was still Mary Pat Stacy, and that's how a lot of people knew me. That was my married name. I'd been married for a short time, had a small child, and my husband had died. I moved here with a friend whose husband also was killed in the same accident, and we needed a place to go. I had just gotten my degree from the U of M Flint College, and I was anxious to move out east. But my friend Colleen said, well, I don't know if I want to go that far. She had 3 small children under the age of 5, and a brother who lived in Marquette and worked at Northern. So we came up here and found houses to live in, and we thought it was a great little town. It had a university, and it was much better than the place we came from, which was really small. It was a little small farming community, Brown City, down in the Thumb. So we settled in, and I figured I'd stay a year or 2 and then move on to bigger pastures, but somehow I never got out of here. It would have been September of '72 when I actually started my first job up here. So sometime during that winter, and I don't recall who said something to me or what I might have heard, that there was a bunch of women getting together at the old Guild Hall talking about a women's center. I had been a member of the Detroit Women's Coalition, Liberation Coalition, and was just getting involved in feminist ideas and workshops and so on, so I was kind of looking for that at the time. I remember going there, and to the best of my memory, there were probably 25 women there, and I think Holly Greer, Gail Griffith, Sally Mae, there were a few other, Sandra Castleman, a few people. And somebody said something to Mary Soper, and she came up to me and said, oh, somebody told me there's another young widow here. And it's like we had that little, oh, you too, me too, and got talking, and that was my first meeting with women from the Women's Center, and it was great. I just knew that it was going to work. We just started. I don't remember if we had frequent meetings or not. We didn't have a center. We were not at Northern yet, so Guild Hall was pretty much the place that we would gather together.
Would that have been considered the consciousness-raising group stage, because that preceded the Northern Sisters?
We were talking about how to get a women's center going, and I know that Gail and they were talking about, and Holly wasn't even a director yet, I don't believe.
No.
Talking about who to hire, so it was kind of organizational. But along with that, at the same time, we got a lot of women who wanted to do the consciousness raising. We used to meet in the basement of would have been the Presbyterian church, where the Marquette Co-op Nursery was also. And we would meet there once a week. I remember sitting around a circle on the floor with Christina Sari and Sandra Castleman and Yolanda Saldana, all these people. And we would just talk, meet each week, and if somebody had a concern or a problem or something they were working through, we dealt with that, And as kind of a outgrowth of that, maybe, we did then, once the Women's Center got more firmly established, we were doing a lot of outreach. And that was always my interest. And I worked a lot with Mary Soper, Victoria Cosby, a few other people. There was a program that took us into the high schools. And we would generally go in groups of 3. And we just basically would go and present our story, the things that we had overcome or things that we were doing, talk about, the role of women and all the changes, and just kind of try to go to the corners of the UP and give some bigger perspective to high school women.
Was that as volunteers?
That was just volunteer, absolutely. I remember just this past winter I decided I was going to clean out my basement, and I started throwing stuff away that I just should never have kept this long. And I remember I came across these letters from, the counselors or whatever in Iron Mountain and different places around the UP thanking us for coming and talking to their girls, you know, over in Nagani, whatever. So we did that probably for a year or two. I don't know how long I was involved with that. The other thing we did was we were doing goal setting workshops. We had a lot of different kinds, and I remember that would be a whole afternoon. You would teach a small group of people how to set short-term goals and long-term goals. I remember working over at Northern with women in one of the dormitories. I think Frida Wara was one of my students.
It worked. It worked for Frida and her project.
Teaching them how to visualize, how to make long and short-term goals. So we were working in different capacities. You know.
Did you find that those kinds of skills basically were lacking in many of these young women? I mean, it really was a need that they may not have realized that this was important.
I think it's lacking even today in a lot of people. You know, who's out there teaching you how to set realistic long-term goals and short-term goals? And we had, and I don't know where the workshop materials came from, but we had trained in this. It's basically, there's some really specific things you can do to really decide if your goals are achievable and believable and realistic, and how you can go about setting your short-term goals so that they enable you then towards your long-term goal. You know, to really think and kind of plan out your future and what you really want to see for yourself.
That's helpful. I don't know that this has come out in any of the previous interviews. There really were some printed guidelines that for your training. It wasn't just hit and miss then.
No, this was a goal-setting workshop, and I don't know where the printed materials came from, and I don't have them anymore. But there were two separate, you know, there was short-term, there was long-term, and there were specific things. We would take them through, you know, visualization. You know, everybody's just laying down with their eyes closed, and then we would take them into the future and back. We would have them write things. It would be a full-day workshop.
Okay, that was what I was. It wasn't just like after school.
No. This would be like on a weekend or something. This would be like a Saturday workshop. It would be like a 4-hour or something. And those were fun to do. I was always more involved with the outreach. We had our office at Northern during that time. Then at some point, I remember going in and out of there a lot. And Judy Russell was the counselor at the time. Did some work with us also, because she was a little more professional than we were, of course. She was our paid person. The other thing I remember doing that was really fun was at one point we got calls from Traverse City, and they wanted to start a women's center. So I can remember that at that point, Victoria Cosby and Mary Silver and I went down as a threesome and spent a weekend down there with some women who were trying to get this going, and help them get their center started. They did get a center. I don't know if it lasted, if it's still there, if there is a women's center in Traverse City or not. But at that time, that was another thing we did. We were doing an outreach to help other places start women's centers. So it was all about outreach and education.
Was there feedback? You obviously enjoyed it. What made it meaningful to you as you went through that? I mean, because it involved quite a commitment of time and.
Yeah, but you know, it wasn't a huge commitment. I mean, I guess I had more time then than I have now. You know, it's harder now that I'm retired. Being in a new place, I was making new friends. You know, it wasn't a full-time job or anything, because I did work. I had a job, but it was just, you know, something I really enjoyed, and I didn't have a whole lot of extracurriculars going on because I was new to the community. You know, so this was my thing, and it was very rewarding, especially when I would talk with high schoolers, you know, young women, and you can tell when you have their attention, and you can tell when it makes a difference. And that, to me, was very rewarding. And after we kind of lost focus with some of that, the outreach kind of, and I'm not sure why it lost focus, but the following years, like into the 80s and 90s, some of the women, I became less involved, and it was more about domestic abuse and the women's shelter and so on. And I feel like lost there someplace was the whole connection with that next generation. You know, who's talking to the young high school women today, and women in college about things. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, talk about sexual assault and safe behaviors and this sort of thing, but what about, you know, the real radical ideas that, you know, you don't have to be real sexy and to be successful. It just seems like the goal setting and the thoughtfulness and the seriousness somehow is gone. I don't know. We've lost something. I feel like that's what's kind of slowed down the women's movement. There's a lot of young women benefiting from a lot of the changes that came across in the 60s, 70s, but it's just part of the landscape, and they're not really involved in it. They have no skin in the game. It's just...
So if you were having a wish list, you would see the value in resuming that kind of activity?
Yes. I don't think anybody's doing that today. I don't think that anybody's out there talking to young women and, you know, kind of like telling them, I mean, they know kind of that they can do a lot of things that they want to do that maybe we didn't know we could do. But it's kind of like, well, what are those things? You know, I don't want to sound dull or anything either, but, you know, is it that important to be, you know, sucked up into just a lot of trivial stuff? You know, it's the sports, it's the fashion, it's Facebook, it's electronics, it's all this kind of meaningless, a lot of it, chatter that just fills up your time, and a lot of it is just mundane. And that's what's filling up a lot of time for people instead of, and to me it sucks up a lot of energy, it takes up a lot of space, so you're not thinking really like some of the things that could really make a change in your life. You're just being kind of entertained all the time.
Well, and that fits into this theme of, you know, the reason for archiving history is so that people of new generations can learn from that experience. And if it was working so well, and we've had persons interviewed who've benefited from just what you're describing, that we need maybe to take another look and revisit some of that.
It's easy, you know, you can keep people really occupied with a lot of superficial stuff and, you know, looking at pictures of food that everybody's eating on their iPhone, you know, and, you know, what's going on with this and that sport. And you get so involved with that, well, then you're really not much of a threat to anybody, are you?
Interesting point. Very interesting point. So, as the program that you were most involved with faded, did you literally lose track of the Women's Center? Do you have any perspective on what was continuing here? Because you stayed in Marquette, right, throughout this time.
Oh, yeah. No, I always kept track of the Women's Center, and I knew people like Sue Kensington that came on as the director, and people that were working there. I was in and out of the center a bit on South Front Street. I'm trying to think what I did there a few years ago. I was in there for something too. So I was kind of, you know, involved, but not directly a lot with the Harbor House. And then I have really, now at this point, I don't have much contact with the Women's Center at all as far as, you know, knowing what they're doing and being involved in meetings. I did get a little sidetracked. Or just, it just
different
was time.
Thing, yeah.
At that point, then, I think what I did was I turned my energies into another direction, which was the Marquette Food Co-op. And that's where in the 90s then, and up till very recently, I was like really involved and very active. So.
This is a bit of a tangent, but a lot of young people involved in that business at every level, right? The food co-op.
Oh, yes.
What would be your take on the young women's roles there? Do they?
Oh, you know, that's some kind of almost a little mini culture. I see some really, really interesting people from being involved with the food co-op. You know, our employees and the different members and so on are the closest I think I can come to saying what it was like, what we were like back in the 70s.
Really?
They're very active, they're very politically aware, they're very, you know, much not just about food, but about a lot of other things too.
And issues connected to
And
food,
issues
but it
connected
draws.
with food, and food is politics, and so is a lot of things. So they're environmentally aware, and they're activists. There is, I mean, there's. I'm not saying that everybody doesn't care about anything anymore. They are very much active and aware. And
Well,
interested.
and again, this is my own perception, maybe based on a lot of these interviews, but there are segments in any generation of society that if they aren't exposed to some of these things, aren't going to know about it, either from the culture of the community or their families or whatever. So that if the educational system can provide some of that through the kind of workshops, we may be catching a cohort of young people that otherwise might not have
Well,
that.
maybe that's why I love this co-op so much, and I think about it now because our classes, everything from education to cooking classes, they're just full. And the co-op is filling a huge niche of awareness and education in this community. Everything, you know, mostly, of course, surrounding food issues, but CAFOs, the Confined Animal Feed Organizations, and safety of your food and political things, and everybody that cares about that sort of thing is involved with the co-op, and so maybe that feels to me these days like, you know, the Women's Center kind of felt like to me in the 70s. You know, it's a happening place. There's a lot of young people involved, and there's a lot of energy there.
Good. Well, and people in the Women's Center may view that as we're sharing the burden, because as you and I had
Right.
talked previous to this, a lot of the retracting of some of those programs was pure dollars and cents.
Yes.
That the grants that used to fund that kind of thing
Just aren't
aren't there anymore.
Yeah, it's true.
But I think for folks like you to feed that back to the board again, that there is a cohort of people out there that supported that concept might light some
Well,
fires.
you know, people can get excited and interested and energetic when it comes to, you know, like environment or food issues. There's no reason you can't also be energetic and excited about, you know, I mean, it's all part of politics, women's roles, you know, and I was very much dead center in, you know, the women's movement, and that, you know, spoke more deeply to me than the civil rights movement did, of course, at that point, because I did not grow up in an era where I had any people of color around me or anything. I just, you know. So the women's movement was huge, and then the food movement is huge also. But they all, I mean, there's enough energy there for everybody, you know.
Well, Mary Pat, is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to cover in relationship to?
Not really, because my focus was pretty much the 70s, and it wasn't that huge, I guess, because
No, it was good.
didn't take that long to cover it.
No, this is good. Thank you so much for your participation, and we're hoping that people watch and listen to these.
Well, thank you,
Interviews,
because it sure was fun kind of jogging my memory and thinking, wow. what
Here
did
we
do?
go. Okay.